September 28th, 2022, 2:30 p.m., Fort Myers Beach, Florida. The water is calm. Families are finishing lunch in beachfront restaurants. A few tourists walk the pier, taking photos of what they don't yet know will be their last normal afternoon. The sky has that heavy gray look that comes before big storms, but storms are part of life here. This is hurricane season. This is Florida. People have weathered worse. What none of them can see from their restaurant tables is that 30 miles offshore, something is moving toward them that will rewrite everything they think they know about survival. In 90 minutes, the ocean will be standing where they're sitting. In 3 hours, Fort Myers Beach will cease to exist as a place where people live. 4 days earlier, on September 24th, Hurricane Ian was just another dot on the weather maps, a tropical storm spinning over the warm Caribbean waters, following a track that computer models showed curving north toward Florida's Big Bend region. Emergency managers in Lee County were watching it, but they weren't panicking. The storm was forecast to hit somewhere around Tallahassee, maybe the Panhandle. Southwest Florida would get some wind, some rain, maybe minor surge, nothing they hadn't handled before. But Ian had other plans. As it moved across the Caribbean, the storm began feeding on water temperatures that were running nearly 2 degrees above normal. That might not sound like much, but for a hurricane, those extra degrees are like rocket fuel. The storm's winds began to organize, tighten, accelerate. By September 26th, Ian had reached Category 1 strength. By the morning of September 27th, it was a Category 3, slamming into western Cuba with 125 miles per hour winds. Then Ian entered the Gulf of Mexico, and everything changed. The Gulf was a bathtub of 90-degree water stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. There was no wind shear to tear the storm apart, no dry air to choke off its circulation. Ian began to explode in size and strength. In less than 24 hours, it jumped from Category 3 to Category 5, with sustained winds reaching 161 miles per hour. The storm's central pressure dropped to 937 millibars, making it one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded. But here's what made Ian truly terrifying. It wasn't just getting stronger, it was changing course. The computer models that had shown the storm curving north toward the Big Bend were wrong. Ian was driving straight toward southwest Florida like a freight train with no brakes, and it was pushing ahead of it a wall of water that would dwarf anything the region had ever seen. Lee County emergency managers were watching this unfold in real time, but they were trapped by their own protocols. The county had adopted something called just-in-time evacuation, a system designed to minimize disruption by waiting until the last possible moment to order people to leave. The theory was sound. Don't cry wolf, don't evacuate unnecessarily. Don't create evacuation fatigue that makes people ignore future warnings. The problem was that Lee County's own studies showed it takes 36 to 41 hours to fully evacuate the barrier islands and coastal areas. When county officials finally issued mandatory evacuation orders for Zone A, the highest risk areas closest to the water, it was 7 a.m. on September 27th, just 32 hours before landfall. The math had already failed. There wasn't enough time. Some people left anyway. They packed their cars, grabbed their pets, and headed inland to shelters or relatives' homes. But many stayed. Some were elderly or disabled and couldn't leave easily. Some didn't have cars or money for hotels. Some had stayed through previous storms and survived. And some simply didn't believe it would be as bad as the forecasters were saying. After all, the evacuation order had come so late. If it was really that dangerous, wouldn't they have been told to leave days ago? By the morning of September 28th, Ian was a Category 4 hurricane with 150 miles per hour winds bearing down on the coast. At 10:41 a.m., Lee County issued a shelter-in-place order. Translation: if you're still here, don't try to leave. The roads are too dangerous. You've missed your chance. Find the strongest building you can and pray. At Fort Myers Beach, the morning was eerily quiet. The usual crowds of tourists were gone. Most of the shops and restaurants had closed. But scattered throughout the beachfront condos and houses, people were still there. Some were in their homes, boarding up windows and moving valuables to higher floors. Others were in what they thought were safe buildings, concrete structures that had survived previous storms. What they didn't understand was that Ian wasn't bringing just wind. It was bringing storm surge, a wall of ocean water pushed inland by the storm's incredible power. And this surge was going to be unlike anything Southwest Florida had ever experienced. At 3:05 p.m., Ian made landfall at Cayo Costa, a barrier island just north of Fort Myers Beach. The sustained winds were 150 miles per hour, with gusts over 180. But it was the surge that turned the afternoon into a nightmare. As Ian's eye wall came ashore, it pushed a dome of water ahead of it that measured 12 to 18 feet above normal sea level. At Fort Myers Beach, the surge reached 13.25 feet, high enough to flood the second floors of most buildings. The water didn't rise slowly like a bathtub filling up. It came as a moving wall, carrying with it cars, boats, pieces of buildings, trees, everything in its path. Residents who had sheltered on the first floors of their homes found themselves underwater in minutes. Those who made it to second floors watched in horror as the water kept rising. Mia Gonzalez was in her beachfront condo with her elderly mother when the surge hit. They had moved to the second floor thinking they would be safe. The water came so fast, she would later tell reporters. One minute we were looking out the window at the street, and the next minute we were looking down at water. It was like the ocean had swallowed everything. They climbed onto the roof and clung to the air conditioning unit for 4 hours, watching their neighbors' houses disintegrate around them. At the Estero Island Beach Club, a concrete building that residents thought was hurricane-proof, the surge punched through the ground floor like it was made of paper. Residents who had gathered there for safety found themselves trapped as water filled the lower levels. Some managed to break through ceiling tiles and climb into the attic. Others weren't so lucky. The surge didn't just bring water, it brought everything the ocean had claimed. Cars tumbled through the streets like toys. A 40-foot yacht was deposited in the middle of a residential neighborhood, crushing the house beneath it. Palm trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and turned into battering rams. The iconic Fort Myers Beach Pier, a landmark that had survived countless storms, was twisted into scrap metal. As Ian's eye passed over the area around 4 p.m., there was a brief, terrifying calm. Survivors emerged from their hiding places to survey the damage, not realizing that the back half of the storm was still coming. The winds resumed from the opposite direction, finishing what the surge had started. Buildings that had survived the initial assault were knocked down by the second wave of destruction. The Sanibel Causeway, the only road connecting Sanibel Island to the mainland, collapsed under the combined force of wind and water. So did sections of the Pine Island Causeway. Thousands of people were now stranded on islands with no way to reach help and no way for help to reach them. Cell towers were down, power lines were destroyed, and roads were impassable. For the outside world, these communities had simply vanished. When the storm finally passed and rescue teams could begin their work, what they found defied comprehension. Fort Myers Beach, a community of 6,000 people, looked like it had been hit by a nuclear bomb. 97% of the buildings were damaged or destroyed. Entire blocks had been swept clean, leaving only concrete slabs and twisted metal. Bodies were found in trees and collapsed buildings, floating in the canals that had once been streets. The human toll was staggering. In Lee County alone, 72 people died, most of them from drowning in the storm surge. The victims ranged in age from 6 to 101 years old, but the majority were elderly residents who had been unable or unwilling to evacuate. Many were found in their homes, trapped by rising water with no way to escape. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Behind each statistic was a person, a family, a life cut short by a storm that gave them no time to run. There was James Hurst, 88, who stayed in his mobile home because he didn't want to leave his cat. There was Nancy Loughran, 71, who drowned in her car trying to evacuate at the last minute. There was the Zima family, Ilanka, 84, and her son Nishant, 54, who were found together in their flooded home, having tried to ride out the storm in what they thought was a safe building. As rescue teams worked through the debris in the days after the storm, they made discoveries that highlighted the randomness of survival. In one house, they found a family of 4 who had drowned in their living room when the surge trapped them inside. Next door, an elderly man had survived by floating on his mattress for 6 hours until the water receded. Some people were saved by being in the right place at the wrong time. Others died because they were in the wrong place when the water came. The search and rescue operation was massive but heartbreaking. Teams used boats, helicopters, and search dogs to comb through the wreckage. They marked searched buildings with spray paint, using a system that indicated whether anyone was found inside. A simple 0 meant no one was there. Other numbers told grimmer stories. In the weeks that followed, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Ian had caused $112.9 billion in damage, making it the costliest hurricane in Florida's history and the third costliest in U.S. history. More than 100,000 homes were damaged or destroyed across the state. Nearly 3 million people lost power. The storm had essentially erased entire communities from the map. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Hurricane Ian was how quickly it had transformed from a manageable threat into an unsurvivable catastrophe. On September 26th, 2 days before landfall, Ian was a Category 1 hurricane that most forecasters expected to weaken as it approached Florida. By September 28th, it was a Category 4 monster that had undergone rapid intensification, a phenomenon that's becoming more common as ocean temperatures rise due to climate change. The people of Fort Myers Beach had been given less than 48 hours' notice that their lives were in danger. Many had even less time than that, as evacuation orders came too late for those who needed the most help getting out. In a disaster that unfolded so quickly, the difference between life and death often came down to minutes. The time it took to reach higher ground, to break through a ceiling, to grab onto something solid as the water rose. Today, more than a year after Hurricane Ian, Fort Myers Beach is still rebuilding. Many of the homes and businesses that were destroyed have not been replaced. Some residents have moved away permanently, unable to face the trauma of returning to a place where they nearly died. Others have stayed, determined to rebuild their community from the ground up. The official death toll from Hurricane Ian stands at 156 people in the United States, with 149 of those deaths in Florida. But in a disaster of this magnitude, counting the dead becomes almost impossible. Some bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea by the surge, or buried under tons of debris. Entire families disappeared without a trace, their fates known only to the storm that claimed them. In the end, Hurricane Ian didn't just take lives, it took the very ability to count them all. In a storm that powerful, in destruction that complete, some losses simply cannot be measured. They exist in the spaces between the numbers, in the families that were never reunited, in the names that will never be called again. The official count may say 156, but the true toll of Hurricane Ian, like the surge that caused it, remains unmeasurable, unknowable, and forever lost to the storm.